It really is a pleasure and an honor to be here with Chris. Chris has made himself into probably the most important conservative activist in the United States. And you weren't always an activist, and you weren't even always a conservative. So how did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, that's right on both counts. And I started my own political development or political thinking on the, maybe even the far left. This was mostly because of being very young and being very excited and being very kind of anti-authoritarian, but also in my own family history. My father's side of the family is from Italy. They're kind of long-standing left-wingers, communists, and so that was always something that was very attractive to me at an early age. And in the process of getting older, entering the work world, having had a chance to travel all over the world, producing documentaries in my 20s, and then starting my own family, my politics shifted very much to the right.
It's funny how that happens.
Very funny how that happens. A kind of inevitable move, but then also, the politics kind of impacted my own working life. I was a documentary filmmaker. I'd produced films for PBS. I sold a documentary to Netflix. And what's happening now with the woke ideology, the takeover happened 10 years ago in the documentary world. And so I had a real sense of where things were about to go. And as my own politics were shifting, my own career opportunities in the documentary world really vanished down to kind of zero. And so I ejected from that career and started doing some political work, some journalism, and then became an activist almost by accident. Was thrust into this with my reporting on critical race theory, became an activist in a sense by chance, and then found out that I enjoyed it. I had a talent for it, and then started figuring out how to connect my journalism, all the reporting on these topics, to actual policy outcomes. And that was really a satisfying thing, because you see your gumshoe reporting, you see your writing and television work, then you see it turning into legislation or a presidential order or changing political life in the United States. And so, and for a lot of times, activist is kind of an epithet in some ways for conservatives. Oh, you're an activist instead of a objective journalist. But I enjoy it. I love it, and I wear it as a badge of honor.
Yeah. And you know what? One of the things that I think is very telling about our time and our country, the United States, is that none of this came from the Republican Party, and you didn't emerge out of the Republican Party, out of movement conservatism, or out of the think tank world, though you are associated with some think tanks. But that wasn't your base. So what do you think it is about the media moment that we live in that you were able to do what you do, whereas conservative institutions were dead in the water?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that other people might have a different analysis, but from my own point of view, looking back, I think what I brought to the table was a very different perspective. So think tanks, kind of traditional think tank eggheads, look at it analytically, they look at it quantitatively, they write long policy papers. I've certainly done that. I'll probably continue to do that in a certain capacity. But they're documents that have very little purchase or very little travel outside of a very limited circle of people.
They're talking to themselves.
They're talking to themselves, but they're also talking in a language that doesn't activate any sense of emotion, any sense of forward action. And by contrast, what I learned as a filmmaker is that your footage that you're editing together, if it's not engaging people emotionally, if they're not outraged, if they're not crying, if they're not feeling a sense of doom, whatever emotion that you want to create through music, rhythm, image, light, character, conflict, all of those storytelling tools, that's when you hook your audience in. That's when you get your audience participating and following your line of action. And then you can then suggest to them what to maybe perhaps do about it in a documentary. And so that was my training, that was my background. And so when I'm going against something like critical race theory, I'm telling the story in a way that creates an immediate reaction I'm framing the stories in a way, I'm using language, I'm making the argument, and at the very end of it, I'm saying, and this is what we should do about it. Actually suggesting a call to action or really a call to taking a policy step. And so those were unique in a number of ways. I mean, first of all, it's a journalism that is unapologetically out for chasing headlines, for moving people, for getting that perfect detail and shaping it in a way that engages people at an emotional level. And then, in contrast to some of our friends who think that journalism has to be, the AP newswire, kind of devoid of opinion, although that's changed even at the AP. I would go on Fox News, for example, Tucker Carlson, and say, this is the problem, here's the reporting, this is what you need to do right now. And so there was an activist component embedded into it. And I think that a lot of the narratives that I've been able to create in the last few years are designed increasingly in a conscious way to shape and to disrupt and then to overtake existing political discourse that's always intentionally oriented towards a political objective. And many people have said, you're not supposed to do that, you're not allowed to do that. I still haven't got the rule book. No one has provided that to me, saying why you can't do that. And I think that consequently, been able to create a new way of doing political journalism that, especially in the last few years, I've seen other people now start to emulate, and that's been something that's also been satisfying.
One of the things that I've seen, I've been a professional journalist for over 30 years, is that mainstream journalism, quote-unquote respectable journalism, is operating by the same rules. They've been completely ideologically captured, but they wear the old-fashioned, we're just being objective standards like a skin suit. So and you've seen this too in academia, which we can get to later, but this is one thing I think conservatives, at least in our country, really don't understand, is how following the rules are being used against us by the left, which has no respect for the rules except as a cover.
Yeah, that's 100% right, and I'd like to say, and I think I tell people very openly, I'm much more honest than my counterparts in the mainstream left-wing press, whether it's New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, a host of other outlets that pretend to be objective journalists that launder in their own political activism or political narratives. In distinction to this, I tell people very explicitly, I am an absolutely committed political journalist. I have political objectives. Here's what they are, A, B, and C. And I also even have developed this kind of habit or practice of actually telling people in real time, and this is how I'm going to then do this next campaign or reporting series. And so I'm trying to, through doing that, dispel this myth of neutral, objective journalism of the mainstream. But I'm also trying to demonstrate for people in our world, you can absolutely break that frame, and then you can attack this a very different way. And so I'm trying to teach people in our sphere, perhaps one way of achieving these political objectives that we have. Because, look, you don't become a political journalist if you don't have political beliefs. I mean, I find it just absolutely bizarre that people who spend their lives reporting about politics pretend to not care about political outcomes. I mean, it's absurd. It's like being a doctor, but not caring if your patients get sick or get healthy. I think it's baked into it, and I prefer to be honest about it, to be open about it, than to play some duplicitous game with it.
So you first made your name by attacking critical race theory, which you have called an existential threat to the United States. Can you first explain to our Hungarian friends what critical race theory is and talk about why you believe it is an existential threat to America?
Sure, yeah. So critical race theory, for those of you that are new to it or have maybe heard about it but not quite engaged with it deeply, which is understandable given that it's a uniquely American ideology. It's an academic discipline that started in the late 1980s and then gained steam over the course of the next 30 years The basic tenets are pretty simple. Critical race theorists believe that the United States is a fundamentally racist country. They believe that the United States promotes the principles of liberty and equality, but those are actually a smokescreen or a distraction or mystification for what is in truth a system of repressive, capitalist, and racial domination. Critical race theorists then believe that in order to go beyond the system of domination, you have to dismantle all of the institutions in the country, including the freedom of speech, including protections of private property, including equality under the law, and even including the existing kind of liberal civil rights apparatus, which they believe serves to actually deepen and entrench inequalities. They want to do away with all that. They want to redistribute property and wealth according to racial categories, and then create a system in which people are not judged as individuals, but are judged on the basis of group identity. And so the ultimate goal is to equalize group outcomes rather than what the Constitution promises and what the American promise had been traditionally, to recognize individual rights, and then, of course, to treat people equally as individuals under the law.
You know, in my book, Live Not by Lies, I talk about how immigrants to the United States from the communist world, from the Soviet Union and from Soviet-dominated Europe, were the first to see what was happening. They could see the fundamentally totalitarian nature of wokeness, of critical race theory, queer theory, and so forth. But Americans just didn't seem, people who were born in America didn't seem to think it could happen here in America. Similarly, I was raised with the vision of Dr. Martin Luther King, the colorblind vision. We were taught that is good and right and consonant with American constitutional principles, and now that's all gone away. Do you have a theory for why it fell apart so fast and why so many Americans are still so blind to it?
Yes, I'll maybe take that in two parts in reverse order. So what you need to understand about critical race theory, and you need to understand about left-wing ideology more generally, I think the best way to interpret it is as a supreme disappointment with political equality. And so in the United States, we had in 1964 and 1965 civil rights legislation, federal civil rights legislation that finally guaranteed equal protection under the law. So with kind of some lagging, maybe enforcement, but in a sense you had political equality, which was always the goal. You'll be treated equally as an individual human being, regardless of race or sex, caste, color, national origin, etc. So you have this great and very hopeful moment in the mid-1960s where you say, hey, look, we finally have achieved equality as it was understood by the founders, which was always a political equality. But fast forward a half century, or now more than a half century into the future, political equality has not translated into material equality, social equality, and other more tangible and cultural manifestations of the promise of equality. And so the critical race theorists were trying to explain why that's the case. And their argument is that, well, all of those, we have essentially fake equality that creates a veneer of equal treatment under law, but actually perpetuates white supremacist governance. I don't think there's any real evidence that that's true. And in fact, actually, what I've learned as a filmmaker is that in some ways, unfortunately, if you look at aggregate as far on racial groups, in many ways we're more unequal than before. If you look at some of the leading indicators on social indicators, you have like household formation, family structure. African American communities are much worse off than they were in the 1960s and in the late 1960s. This is also now followed up with other communities, white communities, Latino communities, etc. But there is a sense, and a real sense, and I think it's something that is serious and has to be grappled with. The promise of equality has not materialized in the way that is satisfactory for many, many people. And so the critical race theorists, though, in my view, are kind of hijacking that sentiment to push kind of neo-Marxist, left-wing ideology that will certainly make it worse. But I think is predicated on this looming sense of disappointment that many people feel.
I think it would probably shock people in this part of the world to learn that communism is really not taught to American students, not at all, or barely touched on. I don't know if you ever had it growing up. Well, you had communists in your family back in Italy, but generally speaking, I grew up at the end of the Cold War, and we all talked about communism.
Yeah.
You didn't have to know Marxist theory, but you knew that communism was a thing, and many people had basic understanding of what it stood for and how it deformed societies and so forth. That seems to have gone away. You can't talk to young people today and find that they you can't have any expectation that they would know what happened. Do you think that lack of historical consciousness has something to do with the fact that wokeness has gone so far in our country?
Certainly, yeah. I think the second historical problem that is the context of this is that Americans, and especially conservatives, saw the collapse of communism as an absolute victory. And so American conservatives said, we fought the Cold War, we won, we've once and for all kind of relegated Marxist ideology to the dustbin of history. Never again will anyone try. They've seen the results, the catastrophe of the 20th century. And so they called it a day. They packed up and then forgot about it. And then, of course, someone who I grew up kind of in between. I was born in 1984, so kind of don't really remember the Cold War era, but kind of vaguely do. But certainly if you're born after 1990, you have no immediate experience of a world with communism. And you're not taught it in schools. What you're taught is racism, fascism, and Nazism, and sexism. So that's the only categorical framing in our public education system in most places. So those are, and a handful of others, they're kind of now becoming kind of even more niche, ageism, or I read a piece of a K-12 school that was teaching that prioritizing adults above children is ageist discrimination. So they're getting even more specific, but the basic categories that they teach, and certainly racism is the first one. The only history you know is the history of the kind of World War II in Nazism and fascism, and then sexism, of course. So you're giving kids an incomplete historical education, but you're giving them also some very basic categories so that all the experience that they see around them can only be filtered or understood through those categories. And then, of course, this is then creating people that are very receptive to the ideas of critical race theory, systemic racism, racial oppression, patriarchy. And so they're primed then for, as they get older, to be introduced to gender ideology, left-wing racial ideology. And then the teaching core in the United States and certainly in other countries then starts to bring those ideas from universities into the K-12 system. And so you have a generation of American kids that also doesn't have their parents. Like I imagine in Hungary, if you were born in 1990, the communist experience is historically very fresh for your parents. You're going to be hearing about it every day, But in the United States, we had almost an amnesia from the Cold War. It didn't affect us in a way as deeply as it did in Europe, and then was very quickly forgotten.
No, and that's how we are as a people, generally. We don't like to look back at history. We always look forward. That is part of our national character, but I think in this case, it's leading us to disaster. You've also been active against queer theory in the institutions. Can you give us a sense of how what queer theory is and how it has affected the United States?
Sure, yeah. I mean, queer theory is very different. I think there's some folks that like to think of queer theory as an analog of critical race theory, but intellectually it has very different origins. Critical race theory is kind of vaguely originates with critical theory or neo-Marxist theory, or what was once called Western Marxism. This is an ideology kind of post-World War II that picked up steam in the 1960s and 70s and then changed over time. Queer theory is very different, though. Queer theory, the genesis of queer theory is in postmodernism, of course, and gender theory more generally comes from a more postmodern tradition. Michel Foucault, you have a kind of left-wing Nietzscheanism that's then applied to the domain of human sexuality. And the basic idea behind queer theory is that that human societies have used rigid categories of gender and sexuality to enforce a heteronormative patriarchal system. So prioritizing heterosexuality, prioritizing a rigid male-female binary, and then maintaining kind of male supremacist power. And they want to disrupt that through different performances of gender. So you get...
Performances of gender, what is that?
So the idea being that we aren't actually male and female. We are certain people that may have a biological category that is imposed on us, but really we are our performance. So if I choose to perform a different role, if I perform a female role, if I perform a non-heterosexual role, if I perform a kind of a role of my own invention, non-binary, whatever it may be, you can disrupt the hegemony of a heteropatriarchal system. You can undermine the heteropatriarchal power, expose it as an oppressive myth, and then have a society not beyond good and evil, but a society beyond male and female, a society beyond heterosexual reproduction. And so what they argue is that you can have a queer normative society that subverts heterosexuality, subverts the male-female binary, and then prioritizes a world that is liberated from all of those. So the idea is that once you get beyond all of the sexual repression and sexual categorization, you can have almost a sexually utopianist queer future. And so this is a postmodern idea that takes on steam in the 90s and in the future.
Okay, but this is clearly insane. And yet, it has conquered so many institutions in the United States: educational, media, the military, and especially big business. I mean, I think that when capitalism became woke, that was when the woke movement really, went into the stratosphere, when it had the power of big business behind it. What do you think about the role that big business plays in spreading this ideology? And I'll tell you where I'm coming from with this. Over here in Central Europe, I've talked to people in Poland and Hungary and other places who say that they are being compelled as employees of American companies or Western European companies to adopt this stuff, even though it's against their conscience. And I can see that companies see themselves as the vanguard of the woke.
It's interesting, and it's a complex question. It's something that's new, but I did a series of reports mostly on critical race theory in Fortune 100 companies. And so I got documents leaked from all of these companies. I think I collected documents from 35 of the Fortune 100 companies. I did maybe a dozen stories, talked to a lot of people. And then I did a summary report that found that every Fortune 100 company, so these are the largest 100 companies in the United States, and in essence, the largest, plurality of companies, or probably absolute majority of companies in the world.
The super elites.
These are the super corporations, the kind of megacorps. All 100 had diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. So this is the bureaucratic expression of critical race theory and queer theory. So on the racial side and on the sexual side. All of them, every single large American company has now put the official stamp of approval on these ideas. And so the question is, well, are the corporations the vanguard of this ideology? I don't think so, actually. I actually think most certainly they are not, but they're hostage to pressures, and they have internal employee activists that look at the institutional pressure points and try to push them as hard as they can. And then you have what I think is a broader collapse of any kind of moral hierarchy or sense of moral virtue or sense of kind of moral good. And so these woke ideologies have become, in a sense, a replacement system for the old moral systems of the past. So even companies 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, they would have corporate social responsibility initiatives. These were projects to educate kids in the inner city. They were projects to help families that were going through hard times. They were projects to have employees do neighborhood cleanups.
The United Way, the sort of...
The United Way, yeah, which is good. The YMCA, the homeless shelters, more traditional American philanthropic initiatives that you can trace back to, 150, 250 years. There's some great work from, I think, Howard Husock, where he talks about these philanthropic initiatives. And traditionally in the United States, we have the most vigorous civil sector, charitable, kind of non-governmental philanthropic sector, where typically the wives of successful American entrepreneurs would manage their social and philanthropic ventures. They would establish libraries and hospitals and schools and all of these good institutions.
Non-ideological.
I mean, non-ideological in the sense that they weren't overtly political. I mean, they're ideological in the sense that everything is. But they were oriented towards a kind of classical notion of Christian charity. That's really gone all out the window. Companies aren't interested in doing that. It's very hard to manage. It's very hard to show improvement. It's very hard to deliver results. It requires you to actually get out and say, for example, go to work with the homeless in the Skid Row part of downtown. It's much easier, and you get much greater rewards by just saying, we love, we're putting money behind a sexuality program in a school, or we're putting money behind transgender social media influencers. It requires a small investment. You get a lot of media attention. You appease the activists within the corporation. And then you get to, in a sense, gain immunity from criticism from the professional activist left. Well, we put money into the, pro-trans movement or march or whatever it might be. That serves as a substitution for the much more difficult work of doing actual charity. And then you get, I think now, unfortunately, you actually get a much greater reward as far as public relations and other kind of measurements that companies care about.
Chris, you moved into closer collaboration with Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida. Now, one of the reasons I'm excited about DeSantis is because he's not like your standard Republican politician who might give a good speech about wokeness but won't do anything about it. DeSantis is actually doing something. Could you talk a little bit about what DeSantis is doing and what makes him different on the American scene?
Yeah, it's been a great honor and a privilege to work with the governor. I've worked with the governor and his team on critical race theory, on gender, on the fight with Disney, and then earlier this year he appointed me to be a trustee at one of Florida's public universities. So I'm helping reform one of these universities, taking it from what had been traditionally in the system the most left-wing university into a university of classical liberal education. So it's called New College of Florida in Sarasota on the beach. And so we're overhauling this university. But what I've observed with the governor and his team that he's assembled around him is that he knows how institutional power works. And he has the courage and the insight to put together policies and political strategies to actually shift institutional power, to shift law, to shift financing in a way that actually advances his political vision, or more broadly, a conservative political vision. And I think a number of unique traits. I think he sees the scenario better than anyone in the game. He has the patience and the follow-through and the strategic wisdom to figure out actually how to appoint boards, how to move laws, how to get money from here to there, how to do all of the actual governance and institutional management to make a difference.
Trump does not have.
Does not have, yeah. I mean, you talk to Trump White House staff, and he was essentially running the government on Twitter, which is kind of amazing, and from my point of view, kind of a fascinating case study in a different leadership style. And not to say that every leadership style has to be the same, but when we're operating from a drastic institutional disadvantage as conservatives, it's essential to have someone that understands how to change institutions. And so the reality is that the institutions submerged Trump more than Trump reformed the institutions. I think that's an obvious truth. And I think with DeSantis, he's shown in Florida and could perhaps show nationally that he's actually capable of advancing against the institutions and then reorienting the institutions towards something better, towards something different. And I think the only other president in recent history rather, who had that kind of vision and unfortunately was unable to execute it was President Richard Nixon. Nixon understood the problem of bureaucracy better than any president, conservative president following him. But of course, Nixon was a kind of tragic figure and was ultimately kind of dethroned by the bureaucracy with the Watergate scandal and following that. So my own read on American politics is that we are stuck in a kind of 1968 loop. We're constantly kind of redoing 1968 over and over and over, both on the left and on the right. You have the Black Panther Party and you have Richard Nixon. That's the fundamental cultural dynamic that we're in, and we haven't figured out how to escape it. So even in Tennessee, I think Ishvan was just in Tennessee and saw some of this live, which is kind of interesting. You have these legislators in Tennessee that are that are doing what is in essence a Martin Luther King reenactment. They're dressing up in almost like old-timey outfits. They're speaking in a very affected black preacher voice that is totally inauthentic. You can listen to the same people who are doing the voice a year and they sound like Deloitte consultants. Yeah. It's kind of amazing. So they're reenacting, and in a very vivid sense, reenacting 1968. And conservatives have never been able to move beyond 1968. Or 1972, let's say, with Nixon. And so maybe not, but maybe, hopefully, someone like Ron DeSantis can actually break that dynamic and then transcend that dynamic, move beyond that dynamic. And if you look at it in a kind of basic Hegelian way, we're stuck in this dialectic, right? And we haven't been able to synthesize and surpass it. And so I think that's the big question for us in the United States is, how can we surpass this dynamic? And conservatives need to get smarter in thinking about it.
So let's shift then to talk about Hungary. You've been here 2 or 3 weeks now. What are the main things you've learned here in Hungary that you're going to take back to the U.S. and to affect your activism?
Well, I think a couple things. Certainly, more learning to be done. You can't learn everything in just a few weeks or a month, but I think there are some good lessons, and I think that from the conversations I've had with a wide variety of people, the Hungarians have understood the institutional problem in a very sophisticated way. And my reading on it is that when you have a state that controls all of the institutions, as it was under communism, you get a very real sense of how institutions can kind of squash private life, can squash creativity, can squash faith, all of the various institutions that make life meaningful, through which people live their lives. And so a couple of specific initiatives that I found very interesting. One is revitalizing religious education. I was told, and I think it's probably accurate given the source, that Hungary has moved from a system in which approximately 5% of kids are educated in religious schools, predominantly Catholic schools, Calvinist schools, to something along the lines of 30%. And they're subsidized by the state to have kind of religious education, or the churches manage the K through 12 schooling. I think that's a really interesting way to do it. We're getting some of that now in the United States with universal school choice. Another I think important initiative is training elites. You know, look, countries are run by elites. Every country in the past and every country in the future will be run by an elite. This is inevitable. And so the question is, how do you cultivate this elite? How do you train this elite? And what principles and virtues should this elite be aiming toward? And the Hungarians, with some of these higher education initiatives and other initiatives, kind of civil society initiatives, are taking that question very seriously. And I think in the United States, we have just a few places where conservatives are attempting to do this, most notably Hillsdale College. But while I love Hillsdale, Hillsdale's
Small
great
conservative liberal arts college.
a small conservative liberal arts college. While I'm a great supporter, it's necessary but not sufficient. And so we need to do this at scale. And I think the question is, and the question that I've been grappling with and then thinking about as I've been here is, conservatives have been promising to reduce the size of the state for 100 years, for a century, more or less. Have never been able to do it. To the point where the United States public sector is larger on a percentage of GDP basis than the public sector in communist China. So the American government, as a percentage of GDP, is larger and more expansive, although not more repressive, than the government of the sole remaining communist superpower. So conservatives have failed. I think that's safe to say, in kind of reducing the size of the state. So the question then becomes, well, if we're going to have a large state for the foreseeable future, and look, I support reducing the size of the state. You know, get rid of many, many things. But given that that's not going to happen in the near term, what should we do with it? And I think DeSantis understands this quite well, is if we're going to have a state, we have to make some kind of peace with this apparatus. And then when you win the legislature and you win the presidency or you win the governorship, you can't govern as a libertarian. That's a kind of I mean, it's not even oxymoron, it's an impossibility. You cannot be the governor of a state and govern as a libertarian. It doesn't make any sense. Why would you even run for office? What's the point? I'm going to win the governorship and then I'm going to do nothing. You know, I'm going to let the free market decide. No, you have a duty to govern. You have a responsibility to manage the institutions. And you have a responsibility to use democratic power, not state power. I mean, you're elected through the democratic process. You have a responsibility to use democratic power to shape institutions in the best interest of your constituents. And that's what the big lesson that the Hungarians understand and Americans, I think, are still catching up.
Oh, yeah, that's the big lesson that I learned from watching Viktor Orbán when I first started coming here 2 years ago. It's that Orbán seems to me to have an accurate read on how power is actually exercised, not simply through elected officials and the bureaucracy, but through NGOs and major corporations, universities, and so forth. And he seemed to realize, too, that the only thing that conservatives have is the power of the state through elections. So when I see some of the things Ron DeSantis is doing, I'm like, he's taking it from the Orbán playbook, whether he's actually doing that literally or not. But that is, I think, going to be the only way that conservatives can compete with this overwhelming progressive hegemony within every other institution in the country.
Conservatives are in a really interesting position where we have very little general institutional power. If you look at media, you look at NGOs, you look at kind of technology industry, if you look at arts and culture, if you look at other aspects of civil society, let's say, or private society. We also are operating at an extreme disadvantage in universities in the public sphere. Most federal bureaucrats, for example, lean very far to the left. In some of the departments, political giving is something like 90 to 10, 90-10 favoring Democrats. But conservatives still win elections. And in a sense, this is the key to everything. Because if you win elections, you get to make laws. And laws are the basis of everything else in a society, right? At the end of the day, the democratic power is the supreme power. That's how our Constitution is written. Of course, the government is supposed to secure the individual rights. The government it should be limited in a way that protects people's individual rights. But in a practical sense, the political power is the supreme power in the management of institutions. And so we have to get more sophisticated in how we manage it and how we run that. That's not to say that you should trample on people's individual rights. None of those, that's not to say that. What it is to say is that take setting the rules of the game seriously. If you have the not just the power, but actually the responsibility to craft laws and set the rules of the game of the society, and you're entrusted with that power by the public, you should do so. Because by abdicating and not taking those questions seriously and not taking action on them, you're delegating the basic rules of society to your opponents, to people who absolutely have no hesitation in trampling on individual rights, for example. And so we're going to have to wrestle with this. And one of the fears that I have, and the questions that I'm trying to grapple with intellectually and then also journalistically, is, are we already in a post-liberal society? I hope we aren't, frankly. I'm a kind of small L liberal at heart, of the kind of classical and constitutional sense. But I fear that we may have already crossed that into a new managerial kind of public-private kind of state and society are becoming one. And then are we in a bureaucratic society where those liberal norms and liberal principles no longer apply? I don't know. I don't answer. I hope not. But I fear that we are verging towards that in any case.
I think that, I'm 56 years old, and I think that if you had gone back 20 years ago and told people where we would be today, not just in terms of wokeness, not just in terms of the sort of things that we show to little children in schools, drag queen story hour, things like that, but also just the way that so much of life is managed, people wouldn't have believed it. Yet here we are. And I think it's one of the things I like about living in Hungary is it feels kind of like America in 1995, when things were still normal, and stable. Maybe I'm getting an incorrect view there, but when I have friends who come over to visit from the United States, they're amazed by this place. First of all, because it's not what they were told by the media and the US government that Hungary is, but also because if they're older, it reminds them of an America that has slipped away from us. Do you get any sense of that from being here?
A little bit, yeah. One thing, I was walking with my wife, and when we first got, maybe a week or so after we arrived and kind of recovered from jet lag, and we're going out during normal times of the day here in Budapest, and we're going in kind of the hipster neighborhood and the Jewish quarter, and going to see some of the cafes and different places. Really nice, really fun. And my wife said, this reminds me of going down to Portland, Oregon, maybe 10, 15 years ago. Vibrant culture, creativity, arts, it may be a little rough around the edges, but there's a spirit of, of creativity. There's a spirit of there's like kind of culinary culture. There's a cafe culture. And I used to go down with my wife and my kids down to Portland all the time. Portland, Oregon, of course, is famous for the Antifa riots and homelessness and drug addiction. Yeah. I go sometimes, but it's quite different now. It's a nightmare now, frankly. But 10 years ago, when we used to go down there as a family, or even 6, 7 years ago, before it started to really turn, and my wife said, "Oh, I wonder if if this is like Portland 10 years ago, is it going to be like Portland now 10 years from now?" So I don't know. That question is really up to you, Hungarians, and how you manage your city. But there is a sense of kind of going into the near past, not the far past, the near past.
The near past.
And look, the near past is a hospitable place to be because you know what the rules are. The near past was kind of nice. A lot of people like the near past. But the future, or the present in the context of Portland, is something you don't want. It really is a nightmare that even left liberals and progressives are starting to slowly accept after all the rationalizations, after all of the elaborate denial strategies. They're starting to see, wait a minute, it's actually not good to have, mentally ill, drug addicted, kind of mobs of vagrants who set the street culture in your city. This is actually not good. People get hurt, people get killed, people overdose, businesses flee. You're ceding your city or your town to kind of to anti-civilizational elements. That's the only way to think about it if we're honest about it.
Okay, this will be the last question I'll have for you, then we'll open it up to the audience. I was once asked by, speaking to a group of Hungarian graduate students, they asked me, where did things go wrong in America? And it was a difficult question, and I didn't give a very good answer because I had to stop and think about it. I don't know that we can point to one event that after that, wokeness was going to take us over. But let me ask you, what can Hungarians learn from our experience about what do they need to put a stop to right now or watch out for to avoid the trouble that we've had?
Well, I would say, there's this idea, I don't know if this translates in a Hungarian context, but there's this idea that there is a slippery slope fallacy. Are you familiar with that? Okay. I think as it turns out, the slippery slope principle is not a fallacy, it's more like a law. It's, the slippery slope is real, it's very slippery, it's very steep, and so I think that you have to set boundaries and set limits, and ultimately what these ideologies desire, whether it's critical race theory or whether it's gender ideology, is to transcend a world of limits, to transcend a world of nature, and even to transcend the impositions of human nature itself. So, they want to go to a world beyond scarcity, beyond necessity, beyond limitation, beyond restriction, beyond prohibitions, laws, etc. That sounds very nice in the abstract as you imagine it, or maybe you're writing about it. Wouldn't it be nice to have a world beyond the limits of human nature? Yes, I don't want to get old. I don't want to, a whole host of things. It would be very nice to be able to transcend. But civilization requires limits, and you can't be shamed out of having a society that imposes limits. And people reject this, people don't like this, people kind of kick and scream about this. But what in the United States we have to do is reestablish limits, which is very hard. We're trying to do this, for example, at New College of Florida, where I'm a trustee. And we're trying to establish limits, order, excellence, all of these things. Merit, rigor, judgment on the basis of virtues or values or qualities. It's in a sense unpopular in the short term among a small but loud fraction of the people.
The professor who just said that if he were braver, he would burn the college down.
One of our professors recently sent in his resignation notice, and he says, if I were more patriotic, I would burn the college's buildings to the ground.
To stop fascism.
To stop fascism. Say, wait a minute, hold on here. You're saying if you were more patriotic, so you're admitting that you're not patriotic, first of all. Okay, fine, you don't have to be patriotic. But you think an act of patriotism would be to burn down an entire public university. He's only been teaching there since January of this year. 3 months. He's become a hero. And what it was designed to do, this guy's a tech guy, so not maybe socially very savvy. What he was trying to do is publicly say, I would burn the whole college down because Ron DeSantis and Chris Rufo are such terrible, bad people. And we know that the best way of fighting fascism is through mass arson attacks against public institutions. Also stupid. But then he tweeted it out. He published it publicly, saying that there's great virtue in burning down buildings. So I lit him up, other people lighting him up, the media is going to light him up. I think he's going to be gone hopefully sooner than his resignation date. But these are people who actually believe publicly glorifying and kind of implicitly threatening violence and arson makes them a moral hero. So he miscalculated, and he's going to pay the price for it publicly, which I find quite fun. And then the other thing is like, great, you're not on board with what we're doing, and you quit. Fantastic. This is great. You're self-selecting out. You're doing our job for us. So I told him, I said, thanks for your resignation. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. And I really mean it. It's like, and then students even came up to me and they said, I'm a far left-wing, gender activist student. You better do what I want. No, not going to do what you want. I'm sorry. We're going to do the right thing, that we're entrusted by the people of the state of Florida. We're appointed to this position. This is our vision for the college, a classical liberal arts education. And a lot of these students are so used to adults folding for them, bending over for them, doing whatever they can to accommodate them, scared of them. And I just said, we're not going to do that. And in fact, we're going to try to make this the best place, university. We're going to try, I hope that it's something that you can benefit from. But ultimately, if you don't like what we're doing, I'd be happy to find you a different university to attend. That's a mature, reasonable, adult thing to say. And the look of shock on the faces, it's like, oh, no one has ever told, I realized at that moment, no adult in a position of authority has ever told these people no. And so I feel like, one of the great lessons conservatives can relearn is a basic lesson of parenting, it's a basic lesson of statecraft, it's a basic lesson of history. You have to learn how to say no. You actually have to learn how to say no straight to people's face, and you have to learn how to say no to people straight to their face that are yelling and screaming and threatening and throwing a fit. Like a child. You say no to your child who's throwing a temper tantrum. No. There's a lot of power in that. And I also tell people that, look, prohibitions are written into the fabric of human life. You look at the Ten Commandments. The first, you'd know better than I would. The first 5 are thou shalt not do this. Look, part of having a civilization means innovation within the context of limits. And so we want to have rapid innovation culturally, economically, socially, technologically, morally, beyond any kind of moral limit. And that's a disaster. And so one of the great, George Gilder, you probably like any George Gilder fans, mentor of mine, great American writer, he says you have to have high entropy and low entropy institutions that balance one another out. You don't want to have tremendous innovation in family structure, but you might want to have tremendous innovation in, let's say, digital technology. And those things don't always coexist nicely. They don't always, they always have sometimes are in conflict, but you can't have a society that innovates on every axis. You have to have a balance between slow and fast, between high innovation and high stability, between transcendence and prohibition.
And on that point, I would say that the one thing I would encourage the Hungarians to learn is that it can happen here. In the United States, I saw so many people, conservatives, think, oh, this crazy wokeness, it's going to stay in academia or the media or maybe in New York, San Francisco. It's everywhere now, and it happens so quickly. And one of the main vectors through which it reached middle America and small town America was social media. So if you're going to make yourself resilient, you've got to be political in ways you've said, the Constantine option, but you've also got to do the Benedict option in the sense that you have got to establish a routine of discipline and learning and spirituality and practicing religion in your families, in your communities, so you can hold on to what reality is. It's as fundamental as that. And the two can work together. Viktor Orbán said once, I don't have the exact quote, but it made a big impression on me. He said that as a politician, he can give people things, but he can't give them meaning. In other words, as a politician, he can build the wall around meaning-giving institutions like churches, schools, things like that, but they have to step up, and families have to step up. And if you sit back, as so many American conservative parents do and did, and just let the culture, pop culture raise your kids, if you're afraid to tell your kid no, and you think you're doing enough by going out and voting Republican, you're going to have a rude awakening one day.
Yeah, I mean, I see that. I'm a parent. I have 3 young kids at home, and I think I'm out there fighting every day politically and public, traveling around the country, working on policy. But my ultimate and primary responsibility is to the people in my household, then into the people in my immediate community. And look, even on a personal note, the last few years, as these political winds have shifted so dramatically, we've taken action to do, in a sense, what you're talking about. As I'm more public, I'm also trying to re-engineer and restructure my private life. We moved out of the city of Seattle, which was just untenable, politically and socially, and for my own physical safety, unfortunately. So we moved to a small town, 10,000 people, different culture, different set of priorities, different structure of society, different political valence. We found a school that was classical, Christian, conservative in its culture and its curriculum and its school community. We found a great church, a Catholic church that, the priest is a kind of G.K. Chesterton Catholic, who he gets up there and says, we got to fight gender ideology in his homilies on Sunday. And then after Mass, the nuns that are attached to our church come and say, hey, Chris, keep up the great work, very, very supportive. And then even in the home, we have kind of a ban on technology. So no phones, no social media, no computer games for our kids. Try to get them outside, talking to real people, which is actually a hard skill for kids these days. We had some kids come over one time, and they were having a very difficult time. They were kind of freaking out, I said, hey, you need to eat? Do you have a blood sugar problem? Like, what's happening here? And then I realized, they're like, well, where's the Nintendo? Where's the phones? Where's the internet? And I said, very gently, well, we have a little bit different. We don't have that. We don't really do that. And I mean, the panic on the kids' faces was just unreal. And they're good kids, and hopefully they'll be fine. But those kind of actions require discipline, they require strength, they require going against the grain, they require sacrifice on your half and really even for your kids. And I think it's really important to have all those local institutions and the people around you. The more that you can be aligned as far as your values, the better you're going to be, the better for your kids. And so, and it's a scary time for parents. And I was surprised to hear even in Hungary some dealing with some of these problems. Anxiety, depression, suicide, drug abuse, alcohol abuse. Kids are having a really hard time. And so without trying to make your kids naive, I don't think I'm doing that with my kids, you do have to protect your kids. And then slowly let go, slowly open up over time. And and maybe this is just like every generation has this nostalgia, but I certainly think it's much harder for my kids than it was for me growing up. Almost everyone I know feels that way, and so you got to do it whatever you can do.